So we've kind of been introduced to three very different perspectives in which to view the city. We heard a very economic perspective and a history of that coming from Peter Nijkamp. Ed introduced us to a very demographic aspect and the spatial components of that. And Saskia now enlightened us with the institutional side, primarily looking at financial institutions. So these are kind of three lenses in which for us to understand the complexity of cities. And then we throw on top of that the social aspect that the public realm brings. We throw on top of that the technological side that we're talking about with smart cities. So all this together gives us a way in which to kind of problematize some of the challenges that cities are facing today. So I wanted to, now that each of you have heard each other's reflections, just to give you guys a moment to reflect on that, and then also open it up to the audience if they have further questions. So maybe I'll just get a brief reflection from each of them, and then we'll go to Septa for a question. So starting with Peter, perhaps.
I think the question raised by Ed was interesting from the perspective of, is the city a material object to be studied in terms of place-based policies and material elements, or is the city a people-based community? And if I would take the people-based community aspect, then I would come rather close to Saskia Sassen, who especially emphasized not only the economic but the human economic aspects. And I see we still have quite a long way to go to get this all integrated, but all the aspects are there.
So I just wanted to respond on the issue of empty buildings in New York City, which of course is much less severe than what's happened in China over the last 20 years, where vacancy rates are as high as 20%, and it's a mixture. In third and fourth tier cities, there are typically vacancy rates for units still held by developers who are unable to sell them, but because they are fundamentally state supported, they are not forced to pay their creditors in the same way that American or European developers would be. Conversely, in the first tier cities, it's primarily about investors who are buying units as they are in New York or London, and leaving them empty because the rents are so low that it doesn't even make sense to rent them out, which sort of raises the question about why did China build so much so soon and often in the wrong places. But I will just also, I feel compelled to sort of add a policy recommendation that goes along with this, because I often get involved in policy discussions around the empty buildings. I think there are two natural things which really feel critical to me in the US context and probably in the European one as well. The first of which is that I start with the strong recollections of Rockefeller Center and the Japanese buying in the 1980s, which it was hard in retrospect not to see that was a good thing for the U.S., right? Mitsubishi Estate bought the thing for $1.4 billion. They sold it for a lot less than that. It was a great transfer to Americans from their buying it. So we don't really want to stop it if foreigners are willing to overpay for our real estate. But we do want to make sure that we're actually managing our city properly. And let me just give two things which I think are really important. One of which is New York has a really screwed up property tax system. What you really want to make sure that foreign investors are doing are paying for better schools, paying for better social services, and you want to make sure that you have a property tax system that charges enough to do that. You don't essentially want to be subsidizing property owners with other forms of taxes as New York does. So the first thing is to move towards a more sensible property or even land tax that actually charges them for as much as you can get away with. The second is making sure that you have a permitting process that is not so difficult that basically the only people who are willing to get through it are people who are building homes for billionaires. And I am totally comfortable with the idea that New York City planning, that the Boston Redevelopment Authority, now Boston Planning and Development, basically fast tracks units that are small, that are meant for middle-income people over properties that are built for the super rich. So you want to make sure you have a planning process that doesn't get totally skewed by the flow of global capital.
What am I meant to talk about? Just like that?
On perhaps the other speakers' presentations in light of what you just shared with us, perhaps.
Well, I thought they were excellent. I'm between coughs. I'm speaking between coughs, so I will leave it at that. I don't mean cufflinks, I mean coughs. Right. Yeah.
And then I know there's some questions from the audience, so maybe we'll turn to you. I have Setha first, and then there's a question at the back after that.
So it was just a question to Saskia, but now that Ed has weighed in, I think let's go back and look at the empty buildings, because as Saskia knows, I actually work on condominium building here and in Toronto, not from a financial but from an anthropological point of view. And I am very interested in the social relations that they create in the city, and I will talk a little bit about their impact on public space. But my first question was going to be about the China example, and then Ed, you offered another kind of interpretation. But I just had a dissertation done on condominium building in outside of Beijing, where we did a very in-depth study of why people were rushing to buy those buildings even if they could not live in them, and why the government was doing it. So I guess I want to turn it back to you and ask the more complicated question of, I go with your logic of extraction, Saskia kind of knows that, but at the same time, are these logics of extraction accomplishing very different cultural scenarios where in China I can provide you a lot of evidence of why they're doing it from a cultural point of view, from a people point of view, why they're allowing it to happen, which could be quite different.
No, absolutely. So I in fact didn't bring in China very much, you may have noticed, because that was right. That was a completely different vector. That was constructed. We have quite a bit of evidence on that. I serve on two academies. One, the Academy of the Social Sciences in Beijing, and the Academy of Social Sciences in Shanghai. So that was speculative investment. A lot of it. It was a different now. That's right, but it was also the notion that you and that is why I think the Chinese case is still different, but stuff is happening, and it's certainly happening in Hong Kong, which is not quite China really. But thank you for bringing that up. It's disastrous what happened in China. You have these empty cities, and what's next we don't know. It's quite. I mean, they have a whole. They have the 100 billion person city where the rural becomes internal to the urban. And that is starting with Beijing, right? So, and the rural is a significant rural. We're not talking little patches of green, vast rural areas. And they have decided that they want that inside vast urban areas. They de facto have the vast urban areas, and so now they want to make good, and sort of produce. And I find that very interesting and very high-level engineering. So the Dutch, the Dutch who are now the second exporters of food in the world, which is unbelievable. Well, they've gone vertical, right? Everything is vertical, and the Chinese are beginning to do that too. I mean, that's a plan. That is what
I agree with you. It's largely speculative. I mean, there are a bunch of different actors to explain, right? One of which is the building side, which I think is driven largely by government-sponsored finance, often by very strong incentives possessed at the local level to goose GDP. And construction gets counted in GDP whether or not the units are sold or not. So if you are a local leader in China and you want to make sure you meet your GDP targets, encouraging the construction industry is the easiest way to actually do that. And on the other side, the question is, and of course you have a strong incentive to keep financing the developers to make sure that they do it, and to allow the developers to hold the inventory in hand rather than sell it so that prices stay high. On the other hand, the householders that buy them feels to me the same thing as American householders or anyone else who speculates in real estate who is overly optimistic about the future. And I would say actually the Chinese home buyers have a lot more to be optimistic about than American home buyers did in 2005, right? In fact, one of the other
things we don't have is Hoku. Let's just say that
sure.
The way to be a person in Beijing, we all know this now, but it's something we don't always think about. Back to Peter, it's your place, it's the place part of the people, but it's the people in place together, is it not? That you want to be a Beijing citizen, and the only way for you to do that is to own something, and the only way to do that is to put all your assets, your family assets, into something and buy it, even if it stays empty. It's a very different system, no?
We should get another question.
Yeah, there was a question at the back, the gentleman back there.
Kyle, we met last week, you don't
That's
remember
right,
my name?
yeah.
Yes,
Welcome.
I'm Vasilis Manastiriadis. My question is, I want to take up one of the points raised by Saskia, but then link it also to the other two presentations. So you alluded to this idea that you have to have a local economy, and why should I need a multinational to buy my coffee? And I think if you take that to the extreme, you're actually making a closed economy argument. I'm not saying you are making this argument, but to the extent that's where it goes. And there must be, or we like to think that there must be a welfare reason why we have multinationals and why we have trade and why we have capital flows in and out from different places, although we know they have very different distributive consequences. So where I want to get with that, and also the question about place versus people, and then the big questions in our field, is something that I didn't hear, which is more about resilience and adjustment. So the problem why, the reason why, in my view, it is problematic why I have a multinational that provides my coffee locally, is that if and when the multinational decides to leave, or there's a shock happening somewhere, so thousands of miles away, which makes the company reposition its sort of assets, I may get no coffee, and I may not have the capacity to produce coffee. As the, yes. So it is that question, the question about resilience and ability to adjust to external shocks, which are more devastating in a more interconnected world, that would drive I would suggest, our view about what we do on the question between place and people. Helping people of helping places, and what we do on the question about how much of an extractive technology do we want versus something which is much more nice, local, but also a closed economy kind of thing.
That's a very good point. So as I mentioned, for certain things, if I need a computer, I need a franchise. Otherwise I go crazy. I have to go where? To the factory to get it, or to... But it's like sophrosune, that nice Greek notion of measure. and so that is one element, right? I mean, do we need everything franchised? Like Barcelona, is a very good example, prime example, that the franchises killed all these old family stores that they didn't want to build empires. They just wanted to have their cafe, their factory, their etc., functioning. So the mayor, Ada Colau, very active mayor, said, no more franchises. And she's one of many that are going in that direction. So everything is a curve, in a way. And so I need a franchise so that I can buy all kinds of things that I could not. But do I need it for everything? Now, the other thing that is in play for me is the hollowing out of knowledge systems, very modest knowledge systems that are local. Take the old flower shop, a mom and pop shop. They had to know about flowers, they had to know about accounting, about epochs, what's the best price, and so you had a modest knowledge function in all of these neighborhoods. Today, it's a franchise. You don't need to know almost anything. You have delegated knowledge to, the multinational that is running it. That's another extraction, and so what I see now in New York City, for instance, is a real attempt in some neighborhoods, mind you can't be super poor, then it doesn't work, but if you are not poor, you can begin to think about using local talent, etc. I always say, there's an Italian grandma in many of these neighborhoods, they could do it, bring in some chairs, bring in some sofas, you can imitate. So everything is sort of a modulation. Did I sort of answer your question? Right.
Were there any other questions on that? We'll leave it to one more question, and then there's a lot of talk about coffee, so I don't want to deprive you guys of that. Two more questions? Sure. Okay, we have one here. If you give your question and then one over there. Yeah, then you can share your question and then we'll have a joint answer.
Okay. I do like your concentration, Ed, on the employment issue. I think the unemployment question and the consequences of that socially and for a variety of things is really a critical one to measure. I look at China and these huge state enterprises, which may be negative in a lot of ways, at least absorb employment in certain ways and have a positive component in the system. I'm curious about your large heartland areas, which are very, very big. What's the role of kind of the historical industrial component there that is really bleeding over into some of the activities that you're looking at? In other words, you'd really kind of go beyond that because of the heterogeneity, I'm sure. But it seems to me that's an important issue to try to get a handle on.
Thank you. And then one more just over here.
Yes, my question is very much related to that, but also primarily for Ed. What is the microcosmic urban dimension to your regionalization of these two issues of underemployment of prime age males and the opioid crisis? Is it primarily a sectoral shift in things? Is it globalization? Is it this interest in the young of being in Peter Nijkamp microcosmic, exciting kinds of environments? How much would that explain? Your geography is very interesting and wraps together lots of things, but if we look at this microcosmic urban dimension, how much R squared do you get from that dimension?
Well, let me add one element that I do think is troublesome, and New York is also an example of that, huh? And that is the expelling, directly, indirectly, whatever, with many other names, of all kinds of sort of the firemen, the nurses, the elementary school teachers, people who have to be on their job every day. You need them. It's not like we academics, we go twice a week maybe to the university or something like that. And they have been displaced. And so there is an ironic loop that has taken place, which is that the municipal government has to enable them. So they give them extra money. That extra money comes from the average taxpayer. And so we are paying, besides losing certain sites for modest or regular, middle class housing in parts of Manhattan, in parts of Brooklyn, we're also subsidizing the subsidy that the municipal government gives to these more modest working classes who cannot afford otherwise to live in the city. And it's all partly an outcome of these very rich firms. And that to me is also an injury. It's an injury to policy, the meaning of the policies. It shouldn't be there. They could contribute more. These are the things that I find that the municipal government of the city, they don't even have the tools to begin to address that. And there, I think we academics, there are multiple vectors where we academics who specialize on this particular, that particular, we could actually enable municipal governments. And if I may, sort of one final observation, there is a much simpler parallel to what I'm trying to describe here, which is how municipal governments have dealt with the tech world. So the mode right now is the techies come to the municipal government and say, you should buy this and this because this is great. My God. And the staff of the municipal government, they don't even know what is A and B and C. No, it should be just the other way around. The mayor should be meeting with his staff, bring in some outside experts, bring local community activists who know what's wrong, and say, okay, how can we use tech to address this? That is one of many options, right? And then, well prepared with questions and needs, invite the tech sector. And you say, how can you help us do this? These are little sort of inversions on some level that we need and that are a bit self-evident and that are not happening. Huh? So.
Thank you. Wow, I feel like we're off to a very good start. A lot of ideas to now decant, and I can see we have food and coffee. So maybe before we break for a 15-minute break, let's give another round of applause to our great speakers here.